Resuming debate, the honourable member from Red Deer Mountain View.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and indeed it's an honour to speak on behalf of the great people of Red Deer Mountain View, and I plan on speaking to some of the issues that are so important to the families and the businesses in my riding, particularly housing, agriculture, food supply, global issues such as energy and food security, and of course, debt financing. As you know, Mr. Speaker, food and shelter have long been considered some of the bare necessities for one to survive as a human being. And yet these two critical needs to sustain the health and well-being of Canadians have been and continue to be put at risk by this NDP-Liberal government's reckless handling of governmental affairs. Well, it upsets me greatly that we're unable to have amicable, maybe even friendly discussions about these issues and how they fail to address in this Budget Implementation Act. We just don't have this luxury. It's necessary, to be blunt. We, as parliamentarians, ought not to have that luxury when this past spring saw the percentage of first-time users of food banks rise sharply to 61%, compared to 43% last fall, according to the Salvation Army's Canadian Poverty and Socioeconomic Analysis. And we should not have the luxury to sit around and act as if this current government's handling of these challenges have been sufficient, when according to the Grain Growers of Canada, Canada's national voice for grain farmers, the average grain farm will pay 30% more after capital gains tax changes. And we should not have any luxury to tolerate the continued endangerment and mortgaging of Canadian lives as our nation continues to face a drought of family doctors and our government continues to erect barriers for healthcare providers. This Budget Implementation Act fails to address these three concerns and, frankly, many, many more. How we as a government can, on one hand, muse about the struggles that everyday Canadians face in being able to afford to eat, and then on the other hand, pass legislation that will effectively make it harder for Canadian farmers to grow food for us domestically is frankly bizarre. Now, here's a scenario that perhaps might resonate with a typical grocery shopper. We all know that how the price on fruit works. As fruit goes out of season, the price on the fruit increases due to how difficult it is to source supply. It's a question of supply, not necessarily a question of demand, as I'm sure cherries and peaches are universally popular fruits for most. But you know that what else is universally popular and never in a question of demand? Foods such as meats and grains, which are essential to a healthy diet for people across the world. So while inflation has, without a doubt, played a significant role on the cost of food and groceries, we must look to pull on the lever of domestic supply in our fight against this cost of living crisis. It is a lever, however, that has continued to be neglected and ignored by our current government. We have what is, without a doubt, a carbon tax which penalizes our farmers for working hard to feed Canadians. According to the Grain Farmers of Ontario, it is estimated that up to $2.7 billion of carbon tax will be paid by Ontario grains and oilseed farmers by 2030. And I've already mentioned how the average grain farm, most of which are family-owned, will be forced to pay nearly 30% more in taxes as a result of the proposed capital gains tax changes, which were, of course, removed from this Budget Implementation Act for what can only be described as political purposes. I myself am a fourth-generation farmer, and I can wholeheartedly say that this proposed change will target the retirement plans of farmers, make it more difficult to farms to exchange hands between generations, and threaten the security and long-term viability of family farms across this country. And we will need more farmers here in Canada if we are to have any hope in combating the cost of food for everyday Canadians. RBC found that by 2033, 40% of Canadian farm operators will retire, and 66% of producers do not have a succession plan in place. And certainly what is happening now is not making it any easier. Our farmers and those who grow our food are in need of certainty of their futures, not more penalties on their hard work or more uncertainty about their retirement. When we challenge our farmers, who are one of the most essential components of what makes up the backbone of this country, with more taxes and uncertainty, does not bode well for the future of domestic food production and agriculture in this country. Once again, this budget fails to respond to these growing challenges and leaves much to be desired. This budget fails Canadians by missing the mark entirely in addressing food security here in Canada. And I say this because I know that many will cite worldwide disruptions of supply chains and global trade, and they'll point to the invasion of Ukraine and the conflicts of the Middle East. But for years, I've been involved as part of Canada's delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and I'm very aware of the current situation there, along with the consequences on global food supply. And the OSCE also deals not just with food security, but also energy security, and of course the discussion about security within the continent of Europe. But even after saying these things, and in affirming statements of how food insecurity is a global issue, we want to remind us all here today that to act as if things in Canada are all right, and that agriculture in Canada is not impacted by global affairs, is reckless and short-sighted behavior. In fact, it's unfortunate that I have to point this out, but this behavior has become par for the course after 9 years of this NDP-Liberal government. When our allies face an energy crisis and are in need of alternate sources of oil and natural gas, they can count on us for words of affirmation and emotional appeals of support. But when our allies come to ask for our own oil and natural gas, both of which we have an abundance of, the answer has been, there is no business case. When farmers and food growers here in Canada are allowed to do more of what they do best, that is, provide us with the means to feed both ourselves and the world, we not only help ourselves, but we help our allies in need. And we cannot responsibly prioritize helping others when we can't help ourselves. Canadians want to help their neighbors. Canadians want to be known as the breadbasket for our allies, but only if they are in a position where they mustn't choose between feeding their families or keeping a roof over their heads. Friends and colleagues, Canada stands ready to work hard and to be rewarded. Canadians do not need more government tools, they need less government barriers. A food production renaissance in this country will fundamentally shift our approach to tackling the cost of living crisis we face after 12 years of reckless, unabated government spending. Whether you're a banker on Bay Street, a construction worker maintaining critical infrastructure, a police officer protecting our streets, or a nurse coming off a 12-hour night shift, we are all Canadians and we all need to eat. Empowering our farmers by removing unfair and unjust penalties, continuing to support community initiatives such as 4-H Canada, which will nurture our next generation of food growers, and prioritizing common sense over ideology are what we need to get this country back on track, so that young students are able to focus on studying for their next quiz instead of having to worry about what to eat. I cannot in good conscience support this Budget Implementation Act, knowing that there is so much that this budget fails to address. $61 billion in new spending is not the answer we need in bringing down inflation and lowering interest rates. Canada will have to spend $54.1 billion to service our national debt, which is more than we're currently sending to provinces for health care. Instead of printing more money to help Canadians scrape by, we need to start producing more of what that money buys. And under a future Conservative government, we will axe the tax on farmers, build more homes for families to eat their suppers in, fix the budget to allocate modern supports for those who grow our food, and stop the crime against hardworking Canadians who want nothing more than to raise responsible citizens and make Canada the greatest place to live on earth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, we have a great value and respect for the fine work that our farmers do day in, day out, 365 days a year, Mr. Speaker. Let there be no doubt about that. Whether it's addressing the needs through drought situations or promoting trade. Just earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, I was with the Minister of Agriculture, where we opened up one of the greatest economic opportunities for the future of agri-foods by opening up an office in Manila, Mr. Speaker, a trade office for 40 Asian countries. And I'm wondering if the member would recognize, not only do we have budgetary measures that support farmers, but other initiatives. Does he support the agri-food office opening in Manila?
The Honourable Member from Red Deer, Mountain View.
Well, I thank the member very much for his comments, and of course I always enjoy having the opportunity to listen to him, and we get that quite often. But I have been on the International Trade Committee for a number of years, and I had opportunities, to go around the world and see just how well thought of Canada was in the trading world, and that the fact that this government continues to try to deal with some of those things and to keep that going, it can be appreciated, because I think it's important that we continue to do the great work that was really put down by the Conservatives when we were last in power. It's something that is so critical, and of course, in agriculture, it really becomes one of the most important parts, because yes, we grow a lot of grain, but if we are going to be successful, we have to make sure that it gets to world markets.
L'honorable député de...
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Bienville. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my Conservative colleagues. My son worked on these issues, and you talked about where you live and the fact that you grow a lot of grain and wheat, but the oil industry is also important in your region. Now, we do have to fight against climate change. I imagine that my colleague agrees with that. So what does he have to say about measures that are put in place for assuring a just transition?
Well, thank you very much, and I do agree with the member that oil is important, but it is not just important in my province. It is important for Canada. It is important for the world. And since we are the ones that are able to produce this oil and gas most efficiently and with the least emissions around the world, that is the drops of oil and atoms and molecules of natural gas that should be moved, and we should be finding markets for them, because we will continue to need them. It doesn't matter if we're going to be putting in windmills or solar panels or geothermal. All of those types of operations for renewables require a massive amount of hydrocarbons in order to build them, in order to get the rare earth minerals, in order to put those together. We have this concept here that says, well, we'll just ignore that. We'll ignore how all of these other sources of energy come to be, but we will just talk about the fact that it seems to be a pretty good whipping boy here in Canada to go after oil and gas. The last drop of oil and gas in this earth should come out of Canada.
The Honourable questions and comments. The Honourable Member from Nunavut.
I know that he thinks that there's not enough investments for farmers. Whatever he thinks there is for farmers, there's even far less for hunters in the north. And we know that poverty is greatly. The rates of poverty are much higher in the Arctic. And I wonder if the member agrees that whatever investments that are made for farmers, there must be comparable investments for hunters, so that hunters can provide for their families, for the communities, and for Canadians as well.
The Honourable Member from Red Deer Mountain View.
Well, thank
the member very much for, excuse me, for the question. And of course it is critical because harvesting, whether it comes off of land that we grow or whether it is the animals on the earth that are part of our whether it be tradition or just the fact that we need to eat, those are important things. And I believe when the government talks about agriculture, that they should be dealing with that part as well. I know that people compartmentalize and say that hunting is different than the other part, but to me, it is something critical, especially for the North.